Hey there, welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here today. It's chilly and weird outside, so I'm just gonna be, warm and weird in here. So thanks for joining me. Um, so we have, we're now in a new season, and I always love the transition from season to season because it gives me an opportunity to kind of like pause and think about where we're going, where we're headed, that kind of thing. And it's sad in many ways to see this Christmas Epiphany season close. But then you enter into something else and you start to get ready. And my brain very quickly has to move into Lent and Ash Wednesday and Lent and Easter and all that kind of stuff because it's very early this year. I think it's as early as it can be now that I think about it. It's like Ash Wednesday is on Valentine's Day, which also happens to be Liam's birthday. And then Easter is like the 31st of March. So that's coming up. That's quick. So it means mentally, I think for you at least, it means more mentally getting a sense of what this next Lenten season looks like. But for now, we're in a mode where we're getting used to the idea of where will the ministry of Jesus take us this time. And this Sunday is sometimes, depending on the year, when you transition out of the story of the baptism, you start to kind of see some of the beginning stories of Jesus' ministry with his disciples in Galilee. Like you start to see some of those like grown up passages about Jesus. And so the one I chose this year, though, isn't that at all. But it's a calling story. But this happens to be a calling story that we see in 1 Samuel. So I chose this story, I think, because one, I think it's one of those stories that I think we all identify with in a very particular way, in a very unique way. I think we all think of something very different whenever we hear this story. And this is the story in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and it's literally Samuel's calling story. So just as a reminder about who Samuel is, and trying to connect it to Jesus, just for the sake of reference. So Samuel is the last judge, and he's a prophet, but he's the last judge in the line of judges. Okay. And Samuel is there at a extraordinarily crucial time in the history of the people of Israel. So there's Eli, who is the priest, and Samuel, who's being brought up basically by Eli, and he's called to be a prophet in this very unique way. And what we see in Samuel's story moving forward is he is the one who very reluctantly crowns Saul as king. Or he's there in the midst of all of Saul being crowned as king, and then has to rebuke Saul. Has to say, you're not it. You're not doing it, and then conducts the search for the new king, King David. so that begins our journey of kind of understanding the Davidic line that gets us to Jesus. So Samuel and Jesus are connected in that very kind of specific way. This story often gets matched with Jesus calling his disciples, and that of course makes sense. But I think in some ways it also is a good connection to some of the stories that we see where Jesus has to recognize, accept, take on his own identity. So I think it's a really good pairing with stories like his wilderness story, where he kind of goes into it unknown and searching for himself and searching for who he's supposed to be, and is tested. Samuel is tested in this story, but in a very different type of way. It's more of a emotional testing than a spiritual battle kind of testing or physical kind of testing. But I also think that it's a good story to read right after the baptism of Jesus. We're in this season, we often look at the transfiguration of Jesus, and so this Samuel calling story, I think, really connects well with things that we're going to be thinking about in this season anyway. And so Samuel really sets the stage for where we're moving in a messianic kind of way. And his relationship with Eli, his relationship with Saul, his relationship with David, his relationship with God is very unique. And I think if you really wanted to kind of understand the narrative of the Old Testament, I certainly think that this book, 1 Samuel, is a really good one to read. It's hard not to want to read, like Exodus. It's hard not to want to read something like, Isaiah or Jeremiah. But I think that the 1 Samuel gives you this really good understanding of sort of how we get from the original families and tribes of Israel to the kingdom that is Israel, the divided kingdom that is Israel, and then what kind of sets the stage for the exile. Samuel really gives us that kind of way into understanding where this is headed. Because so much history, geopolitical, theological history happens in this book, to get us from tribes, judges, a united kingdom, a divided kingdom. It really starts here with this man Samuel. So this is Samuel chapter 3. If you remember, I'm just going to take us back a little bit. I want to get to the beginning. Here it is. So the other interesting connection with Samuel is Samuel's mother, Hannah. And Hannah is, you can kind of think of her as kind of a foreshadowing of Elizabeth, or maybe kind of Mary, in the sense that Hannah was praying and praying to have a child, and then did have a child in Samuel, and dedicates Samuel to God, which is how Samuel ends up, serving Eli in the temple. And Hannah's prayer, which is in chapter 2, you see a lot of the types of themes and thoughts that you would see in either in um, the prayers that we see with Elizabeth that we just read for Advent, and then I think also in Mary. So I would say if you have some time and you're trying to look and study the book a little bit, I think it's always important to try to read a chapter before, a chapter after, whatever it is that we're reading. That always gives you a nice context. Reading the story in the beginning with Hannah, I think, will give you some of that. So we pivot from Hannah and then into the young life of Eli. So let me get back to 1 Samuel chapter 3. We're going to read on Sunday, we're going to read this story in two parts, sort of as the first reading and then as the second reading. So but I'm going to read all of it here and maybe stop along the way to kind of, add some of my insightful commentary. All right, hold on here. So, starting in verse 1. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days, and visions were not widespread. So, if you think about where we are in the timeline, again, we're before the kingdoms are created, right? We're not to Saul or David yet, because this is young Samuel. We're after, or right at the end of the time of Judges, right? So think about, like, they entered the promised land. They were 12 sort of tribes, sort of loosely affiliated with each other, and they had judges at different times who led them. Deborah and Simeon, and I'm blanking on the other guy's name. Other judges. He'll come to me in a second. And so that time of Judges is coming to a close, and they don't know it yet, obviously, but it's coming to a close, and this is the pivot. So after Moses, after Joshua, during the time of Judges, but right before we see Saul and David emerge on the scene. Okay. Verse 2. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, Here I am. And he ran into Eli and said, Oh, here I am, for you called me. Now, what's interesting to me is, did he just hear a voice and assume, well, the only other person in here is Eli, so of course it has to be him. Does God's voice sound like Eli's voice? Does it really matter at all? I think my guess is if I heard a voice, one of my first inclinations would be that it was someone who I expected to have in the house. Ran into Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lied down. The Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Well, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you, my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So there's some sense that he would have known if he would have recognized the voice, like that somehow if he would have had some other type of encounter with God, that maybe this wouldn't be as difficult. But I think what's interesting, what I find intriguing about the story is, or this segment of the story, is that Samuel isn't concerned. He's not scared. It doesn't say he is. Maybe nervous or something. I mean, if I was an apprentice of Eli, maybe I would feel nervous if I got called in the middle of the night. I don't know how I'd feel if I went a second time. I mean, you certainly see in the way that he reacts. I mean, my first thought is that, one, maybe this has happened before. Eli it says his eyes were dimming, and maybe he occasionally needed something from Samuel in the middle of the night, or whatever. So perhaps him calling him wasn't strange, which is because my first thought is he's not alarmed in any way. If I heard a voice I didn't know at 2:00 in the morning, my guard is going to be up, even here in my home. That didn't seem to be what Samuel was experiencing. He doesn't say like, well, he drew a knife or he got a rock, or he doesn't seem to be alarmed by it, other than wanting to be helpful. I woke up, let me go. His first instinct was, I need to go and be helpful. He didn't just sit up in bed and go, what do you want? He's like, oh, I need to be attentive to Eli, which I think says a lot about their relationship, and I think says a lot about the character of Samuel. So, and then of course what you start to think through is, does Eli already know what's happening? Does he know from the beginning, or does he know by the second time? Because it mentions that Samuel doesn't recognize the voice. What does it say? Something like he did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So that would imply to me that had been true for Eli, and so perhaps Eli had already put 2 and 2 together, and so was waiting to allow him to, kind of play this out. Verse 8, the Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli, and he said, "Here I am, for you called me." Again, not even thinking that this was strange, or even if he did think it was strange, certainly not enough to break in his relational responsibility to Eli. Clearly, Samuel's role was, if you're serving Eli, you just come and, you're helpful if you're called upon. It doesn't matter if you're called upon once or 70 times. You just get up and say, what can I do for you? Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. I see, I answered my own question before about whether he knew what was happening. So Eli puts 2 and 2 together here. See, this is a first look. This is just, again, I'm just reading this with you. Okay. Therefore, Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. I don't know how, if you're Samuel, you're not just laying like this. If Eli is saying to me, okay, it's God calling you, so if God calls you again, say this. Well, I'm not going back to sleep after that. I'm just lying there. I'm going to do what you said, but I'm just lying there. I'm not going to try to, okay. That's interesting. But he doesn't say stay ready. He just says go lie down, which is also an interesting element of the story. At no point is Eli alarmed try to prepare him for anything other than how to respond, but doesn't qualify it with anything. Doesn't say, well, you need to be ready, be on your look, watch out, like make sure you're being attentive. Like he just says that. This is interesting. Verse 10. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. Stood there. Then the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. There's elements of this story that I think I've forgotten, but that's interesting. Verse 12, on that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever because his sons were wicked. For the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Nepotism, am I right? Like, I don't know. That's just what it is. That's his sons weren't living into the covenant, weren't living into who they were supposed to be as priests, and Eli kind of didn't, I don't want to say look the other way, but like didn't do enough to, set them on the right path. Therefore, verse 14, therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated, I can never say that word very well, by sacrifice or offering forever. So Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell of the vision of Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He said, here I am. And Eli said, what was it that he told you? And do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he has told you. And you got to think he's saying that for two very particular reasons. One, because he knows it may have been something that Samuel doesn't want to say. And second, perhaps he has learned his lesson. Eli has learned his own lesson to be, to not put away things that shouldn't be put away. It's interesting, now that I think about it, that this story is really as much about Eli's reaction as it is about Samuel's calling. And I hadn't really thought about that as much until literally this second. That Eli is learning as much as Samuel does. So we'll see if I talk about that. I don't know. I'm going to ponder that for a minute, because he's looking at, from Eli's perspective, Samuel is being called in a couple of times, and by the third time it clicks for Eli what's happening and says, okay, do this, and then says to him later, okay, tell me what God said, don't hold anything back. In my head, unlike me, don't withhold any kind of truth or accountability that's coming, because that's what I did. I didn't do that with my children. I didn't find a way to correct their behavior, set them on a right path, and now, we're in a spot where they're, in trouble. So if this is what is coming down for you, don't make the same mistake I did. Like, face it and tell me about it. Okay. Okay, so verse 18. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. as Samuel, and then so that there's a pause there. So that's the story. The next two verses are like in retrospect, and then years later, it's like that kind of thing. So as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Okay, so just kind of telling us where this is headed. So I'm trying to remember now what I named this. Oh, Read the Room. I think I called it Read the Room. And so my guess is that some of my reflection on this story is going to be about calling, vocation, discernment, but I think also being honest with yourself about where you are. That's what I'm picking up from this story. I call it Read the Room because something that I spend a lot of time doing is trying to understand, like Eli does, what's happening around me and how do I react to it? How do I speak into it? How do I listen? What do I do with it? And I think that's a lot of what you see in this story. And I think a lot of our lesson as disciples is just to understand what's in front of us, how we can be helpful, not assuming that we know everything. Eli doesn't know exactly what to do. He just knows, hey, eventually he figures out this is where you're at, and this is how you need to react to it. So I think it's a fascinating story, and I'm looking forward to looking at it from an angle that I haven't before. So we'll see how that plays out. But that's where we begin. It's we've been thinking about and talking about Jesus directly, obviously, for the last several weeks, and we paused that. But again, I think that there are some really interesting connections with the life of Jesus, the life of Eli and Samuel, and then the folks around them, Hannah, for instance. I think all those connections are really interesting. So, well, that's what I have for this week. That's what I was thinking about. I think this is a fascinating story. So again, read as much of 1 Samuel as you can, just to get an idea of kind of where we're at in the scope of things. But for now, thank you for thinking and contemplating and doing all of that while I sit here in the not so cold. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another First Look. So take care. Thanks.